They said the Alpha King of Blackthorn had never shown mercy, not once in 7 years of rule, not to rival alphas who challenged his borders, not to the rogue packs that burned his villages, not even to the High Council, when they overstepped, and they had learned that lesson in blood. Yet on the night of his arranged wedding, with torches lining the cold stone walls of Blackthorn Palace, and 100 noble eyes watching in tense silence, the most feared ruler in all the Northern Territories did something no one expected. He placed his hand gently on his reluctant bride's trembling shoulder, not to claim her, not to command her, just to steady her. Lyra felt the warmth of his touch before she registered what it meant. Her spine stiffened on instinct, her healer's hands curling tight inside silver ceremonial sleeves. She had spent the entire journey from Moonvale preparing for cruelty, for cold eyes and colder commands, for the kind of king the stories built from shadow and fear. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for him. The moonstone arch above them caught the torchlight, scattering pale silver across the courtyard like broken stars. Lyra stood rigid beneath it, heart hammering not with excitement, not with nerves in the way a bride was supposed to feel, but with something far more dangerous. Calculation. 3 nights, she reminded herself. 3 nights and you walk out of here forever. The Harvest Festival would flood the capital with music and lanterns and distraction enough for one Omega healer to vanish without a trace. She had already mapped the Eastern Gate, already chosen the forest path, already decided that no crown, no council decree, and certainly no Alpha King would ever call her his. She just had to survive the ceremony first. The High Elder began the binding words, old language, older tradition, and Lyra kept her gaze forward, jaw set, eyes dry. Around them, lords and pack representatives from across the Northern Territories watched every flicker of her expression. She would not give them weakness. She would not give anyone here the satisfaction of her fear. But then the king leaned down, close enough that his voice reached only her ears. "If you are afraid," he said quietly, "I will not force the bond tonight." Lyra blinked. The words did not match the man she had been told to fear. She turned her head just slightly enough to see the hard line of his jaw, the pale scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheek, the grey eyes that held none of the cruelty she had braced herself against. He was watching the elder, not her. His expression gave nothing away to the crowd. But he had said it, and he had meant it. "That isn't your choice to make," she replied softly, facing forward again. "The council decided this. A pauser. Not everything they decide controls me." Something moved through her chest then, small and unwanted, and immediately suspicious. She pressed it flat. "He's strategic," she told herself. "He wants you compliant, grateful, easier to rule." She had heard enough stories of Alpha Kings to know how this worked. Kindness as a leash, consideration as a cage with prettier bars. She would not forget what she was here. A political tool. A peace offering wrapped in silver cloth and ancient ritual. The council had selected her the way they might select a bridge, useful, structural, replaceable once the territory tension settled. Lyra of Moonvale was not a bridge. She was a woman who had buried her family in rubble left by pack war politics. She was a woman who had sworn, kneeling in the ash of her childhood home, that she would never become a symbol for the very kingdoms that had destroyed it. The elder pronounced the ceremonial union complete. Applause moved through the courtyard, like a careful wave, measured, political, the sound of people performing approval rather than feeling it. Kaelin turned to face her for the first time fully, and Lyra made herself meet his gaze without flinching. He was larger than she had imagined, broader through the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that filled space without trying. And yet standing this close, what struck her most was not his power. It was his exhaustion. Beneath the controlled stillness of his expression lived something she recognized from years of tending to wounded wolves in her village. The particular kind of tired that came not from battle, but from carrying too much for too long without letting anyone see the weight. She recognized it, because she carried it too. "Don't," she warned herself. "That is how they take you. One moment of recognition at a time." Kaelin offered his arm. She took it because the crowd was watching, because the council was watching, because Lord Varik stood at the edge of the gathering with narrow eyes and a satisfaction she already did not trust. She would play the willing bride tonight. She would smile at the right moments and speak at the right moments and let them believe she had accepted her fate. And in 3 nights, when the harvest festival swallowed the capital whole, she would be gone. What Lyra did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that the king walking silently beside her had made his own quiet decision the moment she had answered him without fear. He would not let this be just a political arrangement. He simply had no idea yet how much that choice would cost them both. The palace breathed differently at night. Lyra had noticed it within the first hour, the way the stone corridors seemed to exhale when the ceremony crowd thinned. When the noble visitors retreated to their guest wings and the torches burned lower, and the performance of the evening finally, mercifully, ended. Blackthorn Palace was vast and cold in the way that old power always was. High ceilings, narrow windows, walls that had absorbed centuries of difficult decisions and never forgot them. She had expected to be escorted to her chamber and locked in. Instead, a young servant named Bryn, round-faced, nervous, clearly unsure how to treat a queen who hadn't asked to be one, had simply shown her the corridor, pointed out the key on the inside of the door, and left. The key on the inside. Lyra turned it over in her hand for a long moment before setting it on the bedside table. She did not sleep. She explored instead, moving quietly through the palace in the early hours of morning, cataloguing exits and guard rotations with the practiced calm of someone who had already decided they were leaving. The eastern corridor led toward the kitchens. The western passage opened to the training yard. The great hall connected to a secondary gate that the ceremony guests had used, less guarded than the main entrance, she noted. She was memorizing the bones of her cage. But somewhere between the kitchens and the great hall, she found herself pausing. A guard at the corridor crossing, older, salt-bearded, standing post with the rigid stillness of someone who had done it 10,000 times, straightened sharply as footsteps approached from the opposite direction. Lyra stepped back into shadow, instinctively. Kaelin walked past without ceremony. No entourage, no performance. He was still dressed in the dark clothing from the ceremony, but the formal weight of it seemed to have fallen away somehow, leaving something quieter underneath. He glanced at the guard, and his expression, unreadable to everyone else all evening, shifted into something that almost resembled warmth. Aldrich. He said the man's name the way people only said names when they actually knew the person attached to it. Your daughter's fever broke. The guard blinked, surprised to be seen. Yes, my lord. Yesterday morning. Good. A single word, but genuine. Get some rest when your rotation ends. He moved on. Lyra stayed in the shadow for a moment longer than necessary. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and the like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive back in. Dinner that evening was its own kind of test. A long table, 2 place settings, and silence that arrived before the food did. Kaelin sat across from her with the careful posture of someone who had also been dreading this, which she found unexpectedly comforting. You don't have to pretend to enjoy this, she said, before she'd fully decided to speak. He looked up from his wine. I wasn't planning to. Good. She reached for her bread. Neither was I. Something almost shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. The council presented this as a strategic necessity, he said after a moment. Moonvale's territory sits across the only pass into the Eastern Highlands. Without a formal alliance, 3 border pacts would have used the dispute as justification to mobilize. So you accepted a wife instead of a war. I accepted a solution. He set down his glass. I won't insult you by pretending it was anything more than that. Lyra studied him across the table. This was not what she had expected, not the cold arrogance, not the casual cruelty. What she found instead was something almost worse. A man who had made a calculated sacrifice and was completely at peace with the cost of it. He hadn't wanted this either. He had simply decided that what he wanted mattered less than what the kingdom needed. She didn't know whether to respect that or pity it. She found him in the training yard at midnight. She hadn't been looking for him, she was checking the western gate again. Distances, sightlines, when the rhythmic sound of steel pulled her attention. Kaelin moved through sword forms alone in the torchlight, slow and precise. The kind of practice that wasn't about skill anymore, but about something else, something quieter. She shouldn't have spoken. She intended not to. Why this late? He paused, blade lowering. He didn't seem surprised she was there. Because no one needs anything from me at midnight, he said simply. Lyra leaned against the stone archway. You could just rest. A long silence. Because if I grow weak, he said quietly, the kingdom pays the price. He returned to the forms without waiting for her response. Lyra walked back to her chamber slowly, the map she was building in her mind suddenly competing with something far less useful. A question she hadn't arrived with. What had made him this way? She started going to the infirmary on the second morning because she needed something to do with her hands. Lyra had always been that way, restlessness in her chest that only quieted when she was useful. Back in Moonvale, there had always been someone who needed her. A child with a broken arm from climbing the wrong tree. An elder whose joints had started betraying them. A young wolf who had pushed too hard in pack training and couldn't admit it. Healing had never felt like duty to her. It felt like the only language she spoke fluently. Blackthorn's infirmary was well supplied, but understaffed. The head healer, a wiry woman named Senna who looked like she hadn't slept properly in a decade, accepted Lyra's offer with the blunt gratitude of someone long past pride. 3 soldiers came in from the Northern Patrol yesterday, Senna said, already moving. Lacerations, 1 possible cracked rib. I haven't gotten to the rib yet. Show me. She worked through the morning without thinking about escape routes or festival timing or grey-eyed kings. Here she was, simply herself focused, steady, careful, in the way that years of practice built into muscle memory. She talked to the soldiers while she worked, asked their names, asked where they were from. A young wolf named Cass from the River Territories, who kept apologizing for taking up space. An older guard called Fenwick, who had 3 daughters back home, and showed her a small, carved token each one had given him before deployment. She was resetting Fenwick's rib wrap when she became aware of someone standing in the doorway. She didn't look up immediately. She had learned in Moonvale that patients felt the healer's attention shift, and it made them tense. Breathe in slowly, she told Fenwick. And out. Only when he exhaled comfortably did she glance toward the door. Kaelin stood with one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed, watching. Not with the surveillance energy she had braced for. Something quieter than that. He looked the way people looked when they had stumbled across something that caught them off guard and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. He left without speaking, but he came back the next day, and the day after that. It was Kaelin who suggested the gardens. Not as a grand gesture, he said it the way he said most things. Flatly, almost reluctantly, as though the words had made it out before he'd approved them. The East Garden is warmer in the afternoon, if you're done here. She was done. She went. The East Garden was unexpectedly alive, deep green hedgerows and late-season blooms in burnt orange and violet. A small fountain at the center that the cold hadn't reached yet. They walked without agenda, which was somehow easier than the structured silence of the dinner table. He told her about a village called Ashfin that the rogue war had reduced to foundations 3 years ago. He had rebuilt it not by decree, but by sending supplies, craftsmen, and staying involved long enough to see the first family move back in. The council thought it was a waste of resources, he said. Why did you do it anyway? Because the people who lived there hadn't chosen the war. A pause. They rarely do. Lyra thought about her own village, about her mother's herb garden, which had taken 10 years to grow properly, destroyed in one night of border violence that had nothing to do with them. No, she said quietly. They rarely do. He glanced at her sideways. She looked at the fountain. Neither of them pushed further. But something had passed between them, the specific recognition of people who had lost things to the same careless machinery of power, arriving at that understanding from opposite sides of it. The storm came on the 4th night without warning. Lyra was at her window watching the sky turn when the rain hit in a single sudden curtain. She pulled on her outer robe, and found herself drawn to the east corridor balcony without fully deciding to go. The view from there opened across the entire valley, and storms over open land had always steadied something in her she couldn't name. Kalen was already there. He stood at the stone railing with his hands braced against it, watching lightning fracture the sky above the ridgeline. He didn't turn when she stepped out. She stood beside him, said nothing. The rain hammered the valley below, and the thunder followed in long, rolling waves, and for several minutes, neither of them spoke, which was beginning to feel, strangely, like its own kind of conversation. "What frightens you?" she asked eventually. Not planned, just real. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Failing the people who trust me," he said, low and unguarded, the words stripped of the control he wore everywhere else. "They believe the king is enough, that I am enough, and some nights I'm not certain they're right." Lightning flashed again. In its light, she saw his face clearly, the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion that lived behind his eyes like a permanent resident. He wasn't performing strength. He was surviving it. Lyra looked back at the storm. Her escape plan sat precisely where she had left it 3 more days. The eastern gate, the forest path, all of it intact. But for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Palace, she noticed something that troubled her far more than the plan itself. She didn't hate being here anymore. She told herself the feelings were irrelevant. Feelings were not facts. Feelings did not change the truth of what this was. A political arrangement dressed in ceremony, built on a foundation of council decisions and territorial mathematics. Whatever softness had moved through her chest on that rain-soaked balcony was simply the natural response of a lonely person to an unexpected kindness. It meant nothing about her plans. It changed nothing about the eastern gate, the forest path, the life she intended to return to. She told herself this while redrawing the patrol map by candlelight at 2 in the morning. She had been meticulous. The northern rotation changed guards every 4 hours, which created a 12-minute window near the kitchen passage, where the courtyard was effectively unobserved. The eastern gate used a simple iron bolt, no lock, no secondary bar. The forest beyond the palace walls was dense enough within 50 steps to swallow a person completely. She had done harder things than this. "You have," she reminded herself. "You survived the raid. You buried what was left. You rebuilt yourself out of ash and stubbornness. Walking out of a palace is nothing." She folded the map and pressed it flat beneath the false bottom of her traveling case, the same case she had arrived with. Never fully unpacked. Always ready. 3 days until the harvest festival. She would be ready. Lord Varric arrived on the 5th day of her residence, and Lyra disliked him within the first 30 seconds. He was smooth in the way that genuinely dangerous men often were well-dressed, carefully spoken, the kind of person who smiled with everything except his eyes. He was among the oldest members of the High Council, which meant he had survived multiple changes of power by being useful to whoever held it, which meant he was the sort of man who always knew exactly which way the wind was turning before anyone else felt the shift. He looked at Lyra the way appraisers looked at livestock. She had been crossing the Great Hall when he intercepted her path with the casual precision of someone who never moved accidentally. The new Luna. He inclined his head, the gesture technically respectful, the tone entirely otherwise. "You've settled in well, I'm told. Made yourself useful in the infirmary." Charmed the palace staff. A pause, waited. "The king seems taken with you." "You say that like it concerns you," Lyra replied evenly. His smile didn't shift. "Everything that affects the stability of this throne concerns me. It's my function." Another pause. "I simply hope you understand the delicacy of King Kalen's position. He carries a great deal. He cannot afford distractions." The word landed exactly as he intended it to. Lyra held his gaze for one steady moment. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked on without hurrying, which was the only victory available to her. She overheard them that evening by accident. She hadn't been listening at doors. She had been returning from the infirmary through the corridor that ran adjacent to Kalen's strategy room, and the door was not fully closed, and the voices carried in the particular way that stone walls sometimes betrayed without warning. Varric's voice first, smooth and measured. "She walks freely through your palace. She sits beside you at meals. Your guards speak of her warmly. Your attention has shifted, my lord. And attention is not something a king can afford to misplace. Silence. Then, say what you mean, Varric. A king who loves becomes vulnerable. Flat. Certain. Delivered like a verdict that had already been reached. History does not lack examples. Attachment is the oldest weapon used against rulers. She comes from Moonvale, a territory that resented this alliance from the beginning. You cannot know her loyalties. The silence that followed was different from the ones she had grown used to from Kaelin. Colder. The kind that preceded something deliberate. My mate, he said finally, each word separate and precise, is not a weakness. Lyra pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her heart was doing something she refused to name. I hope you're right, Varric said pleasantly. For the kingdom's sake. Footsteps moved toward the door, and Lyra slipped quietly back the way she had come. Her breath controlled, her face arranged, her chest a complicated wreck beneath both. My mate is not a weakness. He had defended her without hesitation, without calculation, without the political hedging she would have expected from a man as measured as Kaelin. He had simply said it steady and cold and absolute to the most powerful voice on his own council, and she was still planning to leave him. The guilt arrived quietly, the way the worst kinds always did. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a low, persistent weight settling somewhere beneath her ribs and refusing to move. It doesn't change anything, she told herself, but her hands, when she returned to her room and opened the traveling case, were not quite as steady as they had been before. 2 days now. The harvest festival was almost here. The capital transformed at dusk. Lyra watched it from the palace steps, the way Blackthorn's stone street seemed to exhale something they had been holding all year. Color and noise and warmth flooding through the city like a tide coming in. Lanterns in amber and gold hung from every archway. Music moved through the crowd in overlapping currents. A string instrument from one corner, a deep drum from another, the two rhythms finding each other somewhere in the middle and becoming something neither had been alone. She had forgotten, briefly, that she was leaving tonight. Ready? Kaelin appeared beside her wearing dark clothing that was formal without being ceremonial, as though he had deliberately chosen something that would let him move through the crowd rather than above it. No crown, no guard formation pressing people back, just him. Lyra tucked the observation away and nodded. They entered the festival on foot. She had expected the crowd to part the reflexive deference that power demanded, and people gave whether they meant it or not. Instead, something stranger happened. People moved toward them, not with the cautious formality of subjects performing loyalty, but with the genuine warmth of people who had actually been waiting. My Luna. An older woman caught Lyra's hand broad-palmed, work-roughened, completely unself-conscious about it. My grandson, you helped him last week in the infirmary. The fever broke that same night. Lyra remembered him. 7 years old, frightened, asking her 3 times if the medicine would taste bad. He was very brave, she said, and meant it. The woman's eyes filled. She pressed Lyra's hand once more and disappeared back into the crowd. It happened again twice more before they reached the festival square. A guard's wife, a merchant whose injured son she had wrapped 2 days prior. Each time, Kaelin said nothing, but she felt him watching from beside her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. You remembered all of them, he said eventually, quietly enough that only she could hear. You remember every guard's name, she replied. A pause. That's different. Is it? He didn't answer, but something in the line of his shoulders shifted, not tension leaving. Exactly. More like something being acknowledged. The dancing began as the lanterns were lit. Someone had stretched a wide circle of cleared cobblestone at the festival's center, and couples moved through it in slow, unhurried patterns, while the string players found a melody that suited the evening low and warm and slightly melancholy in the way that beautiful things sometimes were. Lyra stood at the edge, watching, allowing herself this much. Just watching. Just one moment of not calculating anything. Then Kaelin extended his hand. Not a command. Not even quite an invitation. just an open palm, offered, and the choice left entirely with her. She looked at his hand for one breath, longer than was probably graceful. Then she took it. He moved with a steadiness she had stopped being surprised by, the same quality he brought to everything, that unhurried certainty that had nothing to prove. She matched his pace, and they turned slowly beneath the lantern light, while the music held them both. "You've done this before," she said. "Small talk. Safe." "Council banquets," he said. "Under considerably less pleasant circumstances." She almost smiled, meaning everyone was watching for weakness. "Everyone is always watching for weakness." He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse. Tonight, less than usual. She looked up at him. The lantern light softened the angles of his face without erasing them. He still looked like what he was, a man who had ruled hard things for a long time. But here, in the middle of a city that clearly loved him, in the uncomplicated way that people loved someone who had quietly shown up for them over and over, he looked almost— "Don't," she told herself. "You belong here," he said. Low, unhurried. Not a manipulation. She had learned the texture of those, and this wasn't it. He said it the way he said things he had decided were simply true. If you choose to stay, that choice exists. The music moved around them. Lyra felt something loosen in her chest, dangerous and warm, and terrifyingly close to the thing she had been defending against since the first night beneath the moonstone arch. You could stay. The thought arrived without armor, and she stood inside it for one full, unguarded moment. And then she remembered the ash of her mother's garden, the raiders who had come because two packs needed a reason, the way power always eventually reached down and crushed whatever was small enough to be crushed. The fear returned, old and familiar, and, if nothing else, honest. She waited until the palace was quiet. Then she opened the traveling case, took out the folded map, and began to pack. The palace was never truly silent. Lyra had learned that in her first week, the way it breathed through the night in shifts, guards rotating, torches being replaced, the distant sound of the city carrying through stone walls, long after the city itself had supposedly gone to sleep. She had mapped these sounds the same way she had mapped the corridors, cataloguing which noises belonged and which ones would signal something wrong. She moved through the kitchen passage at the second hour past midnight, traveling case gone too conspicuous, everything she truly needed compressed into a single wrapped bundle she could carry against her back. The map was memorized anyway. She didn't need paper anymore. The kitchen passage was empty, the courtyard beyond it, dim. 12 minutes. She moved along the wall toward the eastern gate, keeping to the shadow line where the torchlight didn't reach. The iron bolt was exactly where she remembered it, chest height, slightly stiff from the cold, the kind of resistance that yielded to steady pressure rather than force. She pressed her palm against it, breathed once. "This is the right thing," she told herself. This was always the right thing. She was still telling herself this when the first horn sounded. It came from the northern wall, a single long note, low and urgent, the kind of sound that bypassed thought entirely and landed directly in the body as alarm. Lyra froze with her hand still on the bolt. A second horn answered it from the east, then a third, overlapping the second before it had finished, and the city, which had been winding down from the festival in the comfortable haze of too much warmth and music, erupted. The sound hit in layers, shouting first, then screaming, then the particular percussion of chaos that she recognized from the night of the raid on Moonvale, the sound of order dissolving faster than people could process what was replacing it. Through the gap above the palace walls, she could see movement on the ramparts, guards running toward positions, torches swinging wildly. Then the outer walls shuddered, not from artillery, from wolves. Large ones, she could hear them now beneath the human noise, the snarling impact of pack wolves hitting fortified stone in coordinated waves. Rogue wolves didn't coordinate. She had grown up understanding the difference between a desperate lone wolf and a pack operating with intent. And what she was hearing right now had structure to it. Timing. This was not random. She let go of the bolt. The courtyard filled within minutes, palace guards pouring from the barracks in various states of readiness. Soldiers who had been off duty scrambling into formation, servants being directed away from the outer walls by senior staff. Lyra pressed herself against the kitchen passage wall, and watched the machinery of Blackthorn's defense activate around her. Kaelan appeared at the center of it like a fixed point, while everything else spun. He hadn't taken time for armor, he wore only his dark clothing from the festival, a sword drawn and already purposeful in his hand, and he was moving through his own guards the way a river moved through landscape, directing without stopping, decisive without hesitation. She heard his voice cutting through the noise, calm, specific, completely without panic. Northern formation, reinforce the gate. Second unit, eastern rampart. Nobody moves past the inner courtyard without my order. The guards responded the way people responded to someone they genuinely trusted, not from fear, but from the specific confidence that comes from watching someone be right enough times that following them felt like survival. Then something shifted in the pattern of the attack. Lyra noticed it before she understood it. A concentration of movement near the main courtyard stairs. More wolves pushing toward the center than the perimeter, the breach points clustering not around the walls, but around the space where Kaelan was standing. She had treated enough soldiers to understand tactical behavior, and what she was watching was not a raid designed to take the city. It was designed to take one person. They weren't attacking Blackthorn. They were hunting its king. Varric's voice surfaced in her memory, smooth and certain. Attachment is the oldest weapon used against rulers. Not a warning, she realized with cold clarity. A preview. She was already moving before the decision had fully formed, away from the eastern gate, back through the kitchen passage, toward the courtyard. Her bundle fell somewhere in the corridor, without her noticing. The map, the bolt, the 12 minutes, the forest path, all of it dissolving behind her as she pushed through a side door into the open air. She found him at the base of the palace stairs. 3 wolves circling. 1 king. No guards. Close enough. Her heart seized completely. Kaelan. The word left her before she could stop it, instinct overriding everything. Every wall, every plan, every careful argument she had built against exactly this moment. She ran. She had no weapon. That was the first coherent thought she managed as she crossed the courtyard. No blade, no training beyond the kind that came from years of working with injured wolves. Nothing between her and 3 rogue wolves, except the specific recklessness of someone who had stopped calculating. Her shout had done something she hadn't anticipated. All 3 wolves turned. It was only a second, the fractional hesitation of predators registering unexpected movement, but Kaelan used it the way he used everything, completely and without waste. He drove forward into the momentary gap, blade connecting with the nearest wolf, hard enough to send it skidding back across the wet stone. The second lunged at him from the left, and he caught the movement in his periphery, pivoting just enough that the blow glanced instead of landed. 2 against 1 now, which were still terrible odds, but better than 3. Lyra had slowed to the edge of the cleared space, close enough to be seen, far enough to not be immediately within reach, or so she calculated. She was watching Kaelan's positioning, watching the 3rd wolf, which had separated slightly from the others and was circling wide. And she was thinking in the focused way she thought during difficult healings, tracking multiple variables simultaneously. The 3rd wolf wasn't circling Kaelan, it was circling her. She understood this approximately 1 second before it moved. It came fast, faster than she had prepared for, and she threw herself sideways on pure instinct. Not fast enough. The blade it carried in half shift, scraping the air where her neck had been. She hit the ground hard on 1 palm and 1 knee, and looked up to find it repositioning above her with the patient focus of something that had been specifically instructed. Not random, not opportunistic. Targeted. The blade came down, and Kaelan stepped in front of it. The sound was terrible. A sharp, solid impact, not the clean ring of blade on blade, but the sound of something connecting that shouldn't have. Lyra was already scrambling upright when she saw him. The cut across his left shoulder, deep, his sword arm dropping fractionally before he corrected it through sheer will. What happened next lasted perhaps 10 seconds and felt like something geological. His wolf came. She had heard wolves described as erupting before it was common language in pack territory, almost cliché, but she had never understood it as a literal thing until this moment. The shift that moved through Kaelan wasn't gradual. It was a detonation. The controlled, measured man she had watched navigate dinners and councils and storm-soaked balconies vanished completely. replaced by something ancient and enormous and absolutely without limit. His wolf didn't fight the remaining rogues. It ended them. Not killing blows, he pulled back from that, even now, even in fury, but the kind of overwhelming force that left no question about what would happen if they remained. The wolves broke, actually broke, the coordinated targeting dissolving into pure flight instinct as palace guards finally flooded the courtyard from 3 directions at once. Then the wolf was gone, and Kalen was on one knee in the center of the courtyard, one hand braced against the stone, the wound across his shoulder bleeding with a seriousness that made Lyra's healer instincts override everything else entirely. She crossed the distance without thinking and dropped beside him, hands already moving, pressing hard against the wound with the fabric of her outer robe, calculating depth and blood flow with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 100 times and knew exactly how much worse it could get if the next 60 seconds went wrong. "Stay still," she said. Steady voice, healer's voice. "I'm fine," he said, which was such an obvious untruth that she didn't bother responding to it. The bleeding was heavy but controllable. She pressed harder, felt him tense against the pressure, watched him absorb it without making a sound. "Why would you do that?" she said. Not quite a question, the words came out too unsteady for that, too close to something she wasn't ready to name. He turned his head to look at her directly. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were entirely present. Entirely him, that same unhurried certainty that she had been misreading as coldness since the first night beneath the moonstone arch. "Why would you protect me?" she asked again, quieter this time. The real version of the question. He held her gaze without deflection. "Because you're my mate." Simple, unadorned. Not a political calculation, or a strategic positioning, or a carefully chosen word designed for effect. Just the truth, delivered with the same quiet conviction he brought to everything that actually mattered to him. Lyra's hands kept pressure on the wound because that was what they were supposed to do. But something in her chest, the last standing wall, the one she had built from ash and old grief, and the fierce conviction that belonging to this kingdom would only ever cost her, came down so quietly she almost didn't notice. Almost. The guards reached them. Senna arrived with her kit. People moved around them with urgency and purpose, and Lyra stayed exactly where she was, hands steady, eyes burning with something she refused to let fall. She had a map folded in a corridor somewhere. She realized, with a certainty that surprised her with its completeness, that she had no intention of using it. The confessions came before dawn. Lyra heard about them second-hand. She was in the recovery room with Kalen when the interrogation concluded. And it was Aldrich, the salt-bearded guard whose daughter's fever had broken, who delivered the news with the careful gravity of someone carrying something heavy. "The rogues talked," he said from the doorway. "All 3. Separately, without knowing the others had. Same name every time." Kalen was propped against the headboard, shoulder newly dressed, his face still carrying the particular pallor of significant blood loss. He had refused to be moved to the royal chambers too far from the courtyard, he had said, as though even wounded he needed to remain close enough to respond. Lyra had stopped arguing with him about it after the first attempt. "Varric," Kalen said. "Not a question." Aldrich nodded. "He contracted them 6 weeks ago. The plan was specific. Use the festival chaos as cover. Make it look like a rogue raid. Ensure no single wound could be traced back to a blade rather than a wolf." A pause. They were to leave no king to identify their employer. The room held the information for a moment. Lyra thought about Varric's smooth smile in the great hall. "I simply hope you understand the delicacy of King Kalen's position." The way he had looked at her like a variable being assessed, not a person being greeted. She had read him correctly, and still hadn't read him far enough. "And the throne?" Kalen asked. He had a succession document prepared, signed by 2 junior council members he had apparently been cultivating for years. Aldrich's jaw tightened. It named him interim regent, pending a new alpha selection process. He had the process designed to take long enough that interim became permanent. Kalen was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Wake the full council, every member, no exceptions. I want Varric in the chamber before sunrise." "You should rest," Lyra said. He looked at her steadily. "I will. After." She recognized the tone, the same one he used when a decision had already been made, and discussion was a courtesy rather than an invitation. She handed him the clean outer robe she had laid across the chair and said nothing further, which she had learned was its own kind of care. She wasn't present for the council session, but she heard it in the way that palace walls always eventually shared what happened within them, through Senna, through Bryn, through the particular quality of silence that settled over a building after something conclusive has occurred inside it. Varric had not confessed. He had constructed, rearranged, redirected, with the practiced fluency of a man who had survived council politics for 30 years, by ensuring nothing could be definitively pinned to him. It hadn't worked this time. 3 separate confessions, the prepared succession document recovered from his private chambers, and the testimony of the 2 junior council members who, faced with the full weight of the chamber's attention, had apparently decided that loyalty to Varric was a significantly worse long-term position than honesty had built a case that left no viable exit. He was stripped of rank before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, exiled beyond kingdom borders by mid-morning, with a guard escort to ensure the journey was completed rather than merely begun. Lyra stood at the east corridor window and watched the small procession move through the outer gate. Varric at its center, still composed, still wearing his stripped rank clothing with the posture of someone who refused to let consequences touch his bearing. She felt no satisfaction, only the particular exhaustion that followed the end of something that should never have begun. Kaelin slept through the afternoon. Lyra sat beside him and did not examine too carefully why leaving the room felt impossible. She told herself it was medical, the wound needed monitoring. Blood loss of that volume required observation. Any healer would have done the same. She told herself this with less conviction each hour that passed. At some point, she retrieved the map from the corridor, where it had fallen during the attack, slightly damp from the night's chaos, one corner torn. She sat with it in her hands for a while, looking at the careful lines she had drawn, the eastern gate, the forest path, the life she had been so certain she needed to return to. She folded it once, twice, and then tore it quietly along the folds until it was pieces too small to reassemble. She let them fall into the cold fireplace grate. When Kaelin woke in the early evening, she was still there. He looked at her with the slow focus of someone returning from a significant distance, taking in the chair she had pulled close, the water she had left within his reach, the fact of her presence in a room she had no political obligation to remain in. His voice was rough from sleep. "Will you stay?" he said quietly. "Even if the council never forced you." The last pieces of her map turned to ash in the grate. Lyra looked at him, this exhausted, honest, quietly remarkable man who had stepped between her and a blade without a moment's calculation, and felt the answer settle into her chest, like something finally returning home. She hadn't said it yet, but she didn't look away, and he understood. Peace returned to Blackthorn the way dawn returned after a long winter night, not suddenly, but with a gathering certainty that made the darkness feel, in retrospect, like something that had always been temporary. The weeks following Varric's exile moved differently than the weeks before it. Quieter. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence but presence, the specific stillness of a kingdom that had been holding its breath and finally remembered how to exhale. Council sessions resumed without the particular undertow that Varric's influence had created. Border reports came in stable. The rogue wolves who had survived the attack were tried and sentenced, with the measured justice that Kaelin applied to everything, neither lenient nor excessive, simply fair in the way that only people who genuinely understood consequence could be fair. Lyra watched him govern and stopped being surprised by what she saw. She had come to Blackthorn expecting a tyrant. What she had found instead was a man who treated leadership as a debt he owed rather than a privilege. He held something to be repaid daily, in the names of guards remembered, and villages rebuilt, and hard decisions made without the comfort of certainty. She understood now why the exhaustion lived so permanently behind his eyes. It was the cost of caring about something larger than yourself, paid every morning before the rest of the world was awake. She had stopped going to the infirmary to distract herself from her feelings. She went because she had chosen to, because Senna needed her, and the soldiers knew her now. And Blackthorn had quietly become a place where she belonged, without anyone forcing the belonging. She had not picked up a map since the night she burned the last one. It was Kalen who suggested the Moonstone Arch. He came to find her in the East Garden on a clear evening 3 weeks after the attack, moving through the late-season blooms with the slightly careful gait that his healing shoulder still required, though he would never have described it that way himself. He stopped beside her at the fountain and looked at it for a moment without speaking, which she had learned meant he was choosing words rather than avoiding them. "There's something I'd like to do," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him. "Tell me first." The corner of his mouth moved. That small, rare thing she had come to understand was his version of a full smile. "The arch. Tonight, when the moon is up." A pause. No council. No ceremony. No obligation attached to it. Lyra was quiet for a moment. "Just us," she said. "Just us." She looked back at the fountain. The water caught the last of the evening light and scattered it across the stone in fragments, the way the Moonstone Arch had scattered torchlight on the night of their wedding, the night she had stood rigid in silver robes, with an escape plan already drawn and a heart already beginning, without her permission, to complicate itself. "All right," she said. The arch was different at night, with no one watching. Without the crowd and the torches and the weight of political theater, it was simply beautiful pale stone, carved with old markings that caught the moonlight and held it, the courtyard open and still around them, the city audible in the distance but present only as warmth, as life, as the sound of a place that had come through something difficult and continued anyway. Kalen stood beneath it and faced her, and for once, for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain, not afraid. Just open in the specific way that people only managed when they had decided the vulnerability was worth the risk. Lyra stepped toward him and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers carefully, as though she were something he intended to hold without holding too tightly. And she thought not for the first time that this quality of his, this particular restraint that was not distance but respect, had been the thing that undid every wall she had ever built. "The council forced this marriage," she said. Steady, clear, every word chosen. They chose the territory and the alliance and the timing. She looked up at him, the scar, the grey eyes, the face that had become, without her planning it, one of the most familiar things in her world. "But loving you was my choice." Something moved through his expression, not surprise. Exactly. More like a rival. Like a man who had been traveling towards something for a long time and had finally, quietly, reached it. He brought her hand to his chest, over his heart, and held it there. The bond formed the way true things formed, not with ceremony or force or the pressure of expectation, but with the simple inevitability of two people who had chosen each other after everything that had tried to prevent it. Lyra felt it move through her like warmth, finding the places that had been cold the longest, like something returning rather than something beginning. She exhaled. He pressed his forehead gently to hers, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Above them the moon held steady, silver and enormous, as though it had been waiting for this specific moment, and found it, at last, worth the patience. The once reluctant bride stood beneath the arch, as his true Luna, not a political arrangement made flesh, not a symbol of territorial alliance, but the woman who had seen the loneliness beneath the crown and chosen to stay anyway. And for the first time in years, the Alpha King of Blackthorn was no longer ruling alone. If you enjoyed this moonlit love story, let me know in the comments. Your voice helps decide the next tale I tell. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful Alpha King romances where love rewrites destiny.